This is Times Radio.
Carol Walker with you through till 1 a.m. Now, while many businesses are struggling to survive the restrictions imposed to control the coronavirus, the world's billionaires have seen their fortunes hit record highs. The world's richest people got richer by a staggering 27.5% to £7.9 trillion between April and July this year. That's according to a report from the Swiss bank UBS. Just as the World Bank reports that extreme poverty is set to rise this year for the first time in more than 2 decades. Well, to discuss this tale of extraordinary inequality, I talked just a little earlier this evening to Meata van Boele, who is Chief Executive at the New Economics Foundation, and Jonathan Davis, a wealth manager and host of the Boom and Bust podcast.
Well, in fact, I would take it back to the early 1990s, post-Thatcher and Reagan. Inequality has been rising dramatically, and particularly in the last 10 or 15 years. It's not just this year. I would say the main reason in the last 10 or 15 years has been the bailouts of financial markets. Failed businesses, in other words, and governments and central banks globally decided to, in effect, print vast amounts of money and bail out participants in financial markets.
But what about this specific period from April to July during the pandemic?
Yeah, exactly the same thing. Central banks have been printing literally trillions of dollars, pounds, euros, whatever, giving it to, in effect, shareholders of these multinational businesses. And as the share prices have risen, the value of the billionaires' assets have soared. It's really not complex. It's a thing that we call cronyism or corporatism. It's certainly not capitalism. That's the problem. If we had capitalism, we wouldn't be bailing out failed businesses, and we'd have more competition and more opportunities for other people.
Meata, what do you make of this? I mean, shouldn't we perhaps be glad that at least some businesses are still thriving through these very difficult times?
Well, look, I don't think it matters which side of the political spectrum you sit on. I don't think it matters what your value sets are. There does feel like there's something deeply unfair about a system that would allow those that are already disproportionately well off to be making excessive wealth when others are quite literally struggling to feed themselves and their kids. And I don't blame the billionaires. They are essentially making the most of a system that essentially disadvantages them. I blame the rules and I blame the system, so I think, I agree with the point that the financial markets are unfairly skewed towards propping up and helping shareholders rather than helping the real economy. The legacy of the last recession was that huge amounts of money were created and all of it went into the financial sector rather into businesses and communities. But for me, the answer to this is about changing the rules of the game and skewing the system so that it benefits and values the things that most of us care about.
If we look at who is making the money, the report from this Swiss bank UBS said obviously tech billionaires have made a huge amount of money, and perhaps that is understandable. But apparently industrialists benefited disproportionately. I mean, Jonathan, is that because they're still making things that we need, or is it simply that trick of the markets?
It is actually simply the markets. When you look at who those industrialists are, they particularly mention German and French. Now, you wouldn't have thought of those countries as being free markets, and yet there is a funnel of wealth in countries such as those, and the UK and the US, and if you own the assets and the governments and the central banks are printing money hand over fist, those who are closest to the printed money will reap the benefits. And Meata says change the system, change the game. I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, what socialists want is to raise taxes and take money from rich people and give it to other people. Well, the problem is it doesn't work. Socialism has never worked ever anywhere in history. What works is if you stop intervening in the economy. You know, Sunak and Johnson are handing out these furloughs and job retention schemes, and and apparently this is to help the people. And yet, look what's happening. The economy is in a malaise at best. Okay, we've had a surge post-lockdown, but that's not going to last. We're going to have millions unemployed with the result of exactly what we're talking about here, a tiny number of people who have massively richer. Helping doesn't help. Instead, let failed businesses go under. That's the way you get new entrants coming in. By the way, just like Times Radio, a new competitor into the media system. If you didn't prop up the dinosaurs, then the likes of Times Radio would be able to prosper. And that's exactly the same right across the economy.
Well, I'm glad to see that you support Times Radio prospering in any case. But Mia, to just respond to that point that Jonathan Davis is making there, that actually instead of governments pumping money in to try to save businesses, they should be letting businesses fail that are not doing well and allowing new ones to come in their place.
So I think the two things I'd say is, the free market model has not worked, does not work, and part of the reason it doesn't.
Excuse me, where's your evidence?
Well, let me finish. The reason it doesn't work is that those that have disproportionate power or disproportionate wealth can always skew the rules of the game to their advantage. So this myth that suddenly you can have this completely free market that operates beautifully, that is completely efficient, has always been a fallacy. It does not exist. And the key thing that it does is drive huge amounts of inequality. So when we look at periods where we've seen social progress, it's because you've had the combination of, yes, businesses operating effectively, but also governments intervening to provide an effective social settlement, governments intervening to educate people, governments intervening to lift people out of poverty. Like, that is, any progress we've made has been a combination of the two things. The idea that in the current context, you would say that government shouldn't intervene when we're having to shut down the economy because of a global pandemic, that would mean business after business, even viable ones, even ones that would prosper in a free market, would literally fall to their knees with impact on unemployment and people's livelihoods. It's complete madness. In no world would anyone think that was a sensible set of things to do.
Miata, though, if you say that the system needs to change and that the way that the government is putting money in is only helping some of those at the top, how do you change the way that the government intervenes to prop up businesses without having that perhaps unforeseen effect?
Well, so I think there are two things. So when I say we need to change the rules, I think part of it is trying to get a set of rules that reflects what people value in our society. And the thing I always come back to is, let's think about the people that have earned disproportionately in this period. CEOs of tech companies are important, but they're not as important, in my view, as, say, the carers that look after us and when we're old, that look after our parents, that look after our children. And yet, as a society, the monetary value we put on the work that they do is paltry. Now, there is something fundamentally wrong with that I think goes against anyone's instinct. So we've got to re-gear the rules. And yes, part of that is redistribution, and that's the old model in my view, because I feel like that puts that essentially tries to put a sticking plaster on the problem. It doesn't go to the root cause; it's trying to deal with the symptom. But redistribution, I think, is part of it, particularly thinking about how we better tackle wealth inequality and better tax wealth in order to redistribute that. But I think we need to go deeper than that. And for me, some of the things that we should be thinking about is how we essentially allow greater primacy to put on social value rather than shareholder value, so that things like how much people are paid, the impact on communities, the impact on our environment is better baked into business models, but also thinking about how we spread ownership so that more people have a stake of the pie, and thinking about things like pay ratios. So, those at the top can earn as much as they like, but they've got to lift those at the bottom with them.
OK, let me let Jonathan respond to those points.
Look, let's have a bit of a look at history here, human history. For 99.9% of human history, until the Industrial Revolution, say about 200 years ago only, everything was feudal. In other words, the king or the queen owned everything, and you rented. Everyone else rented everything. You rented your house, you rented your little field. In other words, there was a tiny, tiny number of people who had anything other than subsistence. Then in the last 200 years, what did we see? And by the way, we saw it replicated in China in the last only 30 years. We saw an absolute explosion in wealth and prosperity of the 99%, such that we now live better than Queen Victoria's father. That's a simple fact. So my point is, when you have a capitalist system, which we effectively had in the 18th and 19th century, that's when real people get a chance to grow their wealth. And unfortunately, for the last 30 years, that is the opposite of what we've had. That's why real people's wealth has not increased and the rich have got richer. And I say again, I'm a capitalist.
But can you just respond to that point, that if the government were not to be pumping huge amounts of money into things like the furlough scheme and the other systems that Rishi Sunak has announced to prop up companies, you would have massive unemployment and the whole country would be the poorer?
I've been saying since April, before any of these so-called official people have been saying it, that because of lockdown, we're going to have an extra 1.5 to 3 million unemployed. It's going to happen anyway. All they're doing is kicking the can down the line. They're pretending there isn't a problem. The economy, I'm afraid to say, is toast. Sunak apparently is Father Christmas. Well, I'm telling you, he's soon going to be Satan, because he's going to take all these things away and the unemployment is still going to come. So the alternative is to have problems in the short term, prosperity in the long term. Instead, they've got status quo, stability in the short term, and great problems longer term.
Just one other point. Miata, this report found that quite a few billionaires do actually give a lot of money away, do actually support a lot of good causes. There were 209 billionaires who publicly committed a total equivalent to more than £7 billion between March and June. Should we perhaps be just encouraging a bit more philanthropy?
I mean, look, philanthropy is good. And, I think a lot of billionaires do give to charitable funds. I'm not of the view that just because you have a lot of money, you're a bad person. I'm of the view that actually you've got money from doing things that the system lets you do. But I don't think philanthropy is the answer, because in the end, some of this stuff needs to be structural. It is in all of our interests to have a society in which no one falls below the breadline. And it's not just because it's good for us socially, but it's also, and that it's good for our communities. But in the end, there is economic rationale. All the mainstream economists now will tell you inequality is bad for economics. It's bad in terms of demand for things. It's bad in terms of, productivity in workplaces. And so, there is an interest in all of us to have a system that means that there's a proper social settlement in place.
Miata Fanbule and Jonathan Davis speaking to me a little earlier this evening here on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker, this is Times Radio with Carol Walker.